The dust still hung in the afternoon like a hell breath when Elias Crow knelt, the sun pressing down on his hat brim and the leather of his vest creaking as if it too were uneasy. And from the ground came a voice so thin it sounded borrowed from the wind, a plea that snagged in his chest before it reached his ears. "Please, don't touch me," she cried, and he froze with his hand hovering over the coarse wool blanket wrapped around her small, shaking body. A stranger laid out near his north fence, where the cattle trails crossed and men sometimes vanished, her words cutting deeper than any knife, because fear had weight to it out here, and he knew that weight, had carried it once when he was younger, and mercy had been scarce. He swallowed and spoke his name the way he spoke to frightened horses, low and steady, telling her he meant no harm, telling himself the same as he crouched closer and saw the blood matted dark along her thigh and the dust ground into her hair, saw the way she curled, inward as if the world had learned to strike from all directions, and something old and bitter stirred behind his ribs. The memory of a sister buried under scrub with no marker, because nobody had lifted a blanket soon enough, and that memory forced his fingers to move even as her breath hitched and she whispered no. Again, softer now, like a prayer already half abandoned. When he lifted the edge of the blanket, the sun found what it wanted and his blood ran cold, not because of gore, but because of the story written in bruises and dried blood and rope-burned skin. The map of cruelty laid across a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20. Her leg torn open by something sharp, and her hands marked where they had been bound, her eyes snapping open to meet his with a wild animal's defiance. And in that instant, he understood that touching her wasn't the worst thing that could happen. Leaving her would be. And yet he felt the line he dared not cross, the way the land itself set. Boundaries, and punished men who ignored them. He eased back and told her he'd fetch water and a doctor from Red Hollow if she could hold on. But she laughed then, a broken sound, and said there was no doctor who came without asking questions, and no questions that didn't end with a rope. And the way she said it told him she'd learned this by living through what others didn't, by watching the law twist into something unrecognizable once it rode far enough from town. Elias looked toward the horizon, where the heat made ghosts of the hills, and felt destiny tighten like a cinch, because Red Hollow was 3 hours' hard ride and the vultures were already circling, and because the men who did this sort of thing didn't like loose ends, and because his ranch had been quiet too long for a man with his past. He tore a strip from his shirt and bound her wound as gently as he could, her breath stuttering but not pulling away now, and he told her his mother used to say the land remembered. Kindness, even when people forgot, which was the closest he could come to a promise. And as he worked, he caught glimpses of her story in fragments she let slip between clenched teeth. A wagon ambush near dry wash, a husband shot while reaching for her hand, a choice made between running and dying that wasn't much of a choice at all. And with every word the air seemed to darken, though the sun still burned, because Elias knew dry wash, and the men who hunted there knew the names whispered behind, saloon doors and the badges that shone just enough to blind you to what lay beneath. When he finished, he covered her again and stood, scanning the fence line and the empty road beyond, feeling the old calculus of survival return, weighing one life against the peace he'd built plank by plank, weighing love against regret. And he told himself he could still ride away, that mercy didn't demand martyrdom, but the thought of leaving her there curled in his gut like a poison. And he remembered another afternoon years ago when he'd chosen himself and paid for it every morning since. He brought his horse closer and fashioned a sling, speaking to her as he worked, telling her about the creek that still ran cold, even in August, and the cottonwood that split in a storm, but refused to fall, telling her because stories were a way of keeping people here when pain tried to pull them somewhere else, and when he lifted her, she gasped and clutched his vest with surprising strength, whispering "thank you" as if it were a secret, and he felt the tremor in her and the tremor in himself meet like two fault lines, promising an earthquake neither could outrun. He set her down in the shade of the well and fetched water, and when he returned the sound of hooves reached him from the south, distant but real, a rhythm he recognized too well, the measured confidence of men who believed the world owed them obedience. And as the dust plume grew and her eyes found his with a question she didn't dare ask, Elias Crow understood that lifting the blanket had been the smallest of his choices, and that whatever rode toward his fence, carried a reckoning he could no longer refuse. The hooves came on like judgment, steady and sure, and Elias moved without thinking, lifting her again despite the pain that drew a sharp cry from her throat, carrying her into the shadow of the well house where the boards were thick and the ground dipped low, a place built to hide water from the sun, and now pressed into service to hide a woman from men who mistook possession for right. And as he laid her down, he pressed a finger to his lips and felt the old, cold calm settle over him, the kind that arrived only when the world narrowed to breath and distance and choice. The riders reined up at the fence, 4 of them, dusted and hard-eyed, badges glinting like excuses. Their leader calling out with a voice smooth as oiled leather, asking if Elias Crow had seen a woman pass through, a runaway widow by the sound of it, dangerous and hysterical. And Elias felt the lie forming before the words arrived because truth would kill her, and lies had saved him once before. So he said no, said the god. Land had been empty all day, said it with the tired certainty of a man who knew his acres better than his own hands. And when the leader dismounted and walked closer, eyes drifting to the well house, Elias's heart began to count beats like bullets. The man smiled and said, "Folks around here helped the law, that it was neighborly," and Elias thought of neighbors buried without names, thought of the rope marks on the girl's wrists, and replied that neighborly went both ways, that he didn't take kindly to men sniffing around his water without cause. And for a long moment the only sound was the wind tugging at fence wire and the woman's muffled breathing, until another rider spat and said there were easier ranches to question, that Crow had always been trouble adjacent, and the leader weighed pride against time and chose the road, warning Elias that trouble had a way of finding men who pretended not to see it. When they rode off, the dust swallowing them like the past trying to close. Its mouth Elias sagged against the post and felt his legs shake, then knelt and told her it was over, that for now she was safe, and she closed her eyes and wept without sound, tears carving clean lines through the dirt on her cheeks. And in that silence, something in Elias broke open and healed at the same time. Night came quick and he worked by lantern, cleaning her wound properly, stitching where he could with hands steadied by resolve. And she told him her name was Mara Bell, and that she had once believed in mornings, and he told her about his sister Ruth and the way regret could live longer than grief. And somewhere between the words they made a vow without naming it, that survival would not be enough, that the truth would have a place to stand even if it had to borrow his porch. By dawn he had saddled 2 horses and wrapped her against the chill, and they rode north to the creek and then east through cedar breaks until Red Hollow lay behind them like a bad dream. And at a homestead run by a woman who owed Elias her life years before, Mara found rest and medicine and time, and when the law finally came with warrants and bluster, it came too late. Because the truth had already learned to ride, carried by a rancher who refused to look away, and a widow who found her voice again. Months passed and seasons turned, the cottonwood split but standing, and on a clear morning Mara walked Elias's fence with a steady step. The scars still there, but no longer the whole story. And he understood then that destiny was not a thunderclap, but a long choice, made daily. To lift the blanket, to speak when silence is safer, to love with the knowledge that regret waits for cowards. If this tale carried you across the dust and into the hard light of the West, remember that stories live only when they're shared. So ride with Western Destiny Tales, subscribe, and keep these forgotten roads alive, because somewhere out there another voice is asking not to be touched, and another choice is waiting to be made.